Hello, I'm Maryam Moshiri. You're watching The Context on BBC News. It's 12 months since the collapse of the Western-backed government in Kabul. The Taliban celebrate the anniversary of their return to power, but with an economy in freefall and women ruled out of jobs and education, for most people, life is much harder. Britain becomes the first country to approve a COVID vaccine that tackles both the original strain and the Omicron variant. The removal van is at number 10, but the Prime Minister isn't. Instead, he's having to defend taking a holiday during a crisis. Tonight, with The Context, Joe Twyman, director of the public opinion consultancy Delta Poll, and Amanda Renteria, former advisor to Hillary Clinton. Welcome to the programme. Well, it's been 1 year since the Taliban seized power in the Afghan capital, Kabul. The world watched in shock as the country's government collapsed. Thousands of Afghan citizens and foreigners, fearing Taliban rule, descended onto Kabul airport, hoping to leave, some clinging onto planes. Well, for the Taliban and its supporters, today is a national holiday and a day of celebration for them, but not for everyone. We know that for those left behind, the humanitarian situation is dire. 95% of the population do not have enough food to eat, and more than 1 million children under the age of 5 suffer from prolonged malnutrition. Before the Taliban takeover, international aid accounted for 80% of the Afghan state budget. But countries don't want to legitimise Taliban rule, so that aid has been cut off. Here's the UN. Well, our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, is in Kabul. And Lise, give us an understanding of how much life has changed over the past 12 months for Afghans. Lise, thank you very much. Lise Doucet there in Kabul. Well, the fall of Kabul only came after the US and international troops pulled out of Afghanistan as part of the Trump administration's agreement with the Taliban in Doha. It was hoped the Afghan military would provide enough resistance after years of training and preparation to stop the Taliban from retaking the country. But just 10 days after taking their first provincial capital, Kabul had fallen and Afghanistan was once again in the hands of the Taliban. Reporting from the Times newspaper has revealed the UK government was kept in the dark for months about key details of the deal and the withdrawal plan, despite there being more than 1,000 UK troops stationed in Afghanistan at the time. Well, H.R. McMaster is a former US National Security Advisor. He's also a former Lieutenant General and served in Afghanistan. He told the BBC the West defeated itself in the country. Well, joining us now is Michael Kugelman, a Senior Associate for South Asia, the Wilson Centre, and leading expert on Afghanistan. Thank you so much for joining us on The Context, Michael. Let me ask you, first of all, do you agree with Mr McMaster's assessment of what went wrong? OK, well, let's bring in our panel, Joe and Amanda. Amanda, let me bring you in here because obviously the midterms are looming. How do you think this is going to be used in terms of the way that President Biden's leadership is viewed going into the midterms? OK, well, Michael Kugelman, it's been really good to have you on the programme. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The UK has become the first country to approve a new vaccine designed to provide immunity against both the original COVID-19 virus and the Omicron variant. Britain's drugs regulator says the jab, made by the American company Moderna, would be a sharpened tool in our armoury against COVID. Well, 13 million doses could be made available by the end of the year. Well, to find out more, I'm joined by Professor Claire Bryant, an immunologist at Queen's College, Cambridge. Thank you so much for joining us on The Context. So let me ask you, first of all, tell me more about this vaccine. How does it work? OK, Professor Claire Bryant, it's been good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let me bring in the panel now, Joe and Amanda. And Joe, very much seen, isn't it, that the vaccine in the UK, at least, has been a political success. OK, Amanda and Joe, thank you very much indeed. Now, it's clear to all of us that politicians are also human beings. Well, most of them. So when they get tired, like us, they need to take a holiday. But what about the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition? Should they be taking breaks during times of crisis, like the time we're in? Well, this removal van has shown up at Downing Street ahead of Boris Johnson's departure on September the 5th. But while the removal company works, the PM is in Greece, where he's been spotted shopping for groceries in a supermarket near Athens. And Sir Keir Starmer, the opposition Labour Party leader, has just returned from a holiday for which he was criticised by some, but he wasn't having any of it. Well, President Biden's also taking some time off. He has travelled to Kiowa Island in South Carolina, a place noted for its private beach and its golf resort. Well, let's bring in our panel. I'm not criticising anyone here, but there has been talk, hasn't there, in some parts of the media about leaders taking holidays during times of crisis. And in the UK, Joe, we really are very much in a time of crisis, aren't we? With the cost of living crisis, the rate of inflation, so on and so forth. What does public opinion tell you about how people feel about their top politicians going away? OK, thank you very much indeed to both of you. Stay with us, of course, both of you, because we're coming back in just a few minutes' time with even more from the context. In fact, coming up next, Iran's reaction to the stabbing of Salman Rushdie. We'll be live in New York to discuss a final attempt to protect the world's oceans as leaders at the UN attempt to agree the terms of a UN Oceans Treaty after 10 years of trying. That's all coming up in just a few minutes' time on The Context. Don't go anywhere. Hello, I'm Maryam. Moshiri. You're watching The Context on BBC News. Iran faces international backlash after blaming author Salman Rushdie for the attempt on his own life. The US State Department has slammed Iran's response to the attack as outrageous, disgusting and despicable. The Department of Homeland Security says there is a growing threat of civil war in the US after the FBI search of Trump's home. After a decade of trying, could the United Nations finally be about to agree on a treaty to protect our oceans? Tonight, with The Context, Joe Twyman, director of the public opinion consultancy Delta Poll, and Amanda Renteria, former advisor to Hillary Clinton. Well, Iran has categorically denied any link with Salman Rushdie's attacker, instead blaming the writer himself. The foreign minister said freedom of speech did not justify Mr. Rushdie insulting religion in his writing. Well, the US Secretary of State accused Iran's state media of gloating about the attack. Mr. Rushdie was left severely injured after being stabbed at an event in New York State. He's now able to breathe unaided. There have been calls for the West to stop holding talks with Iran about resuming the nuclear deal. Well, let's talk now to Behnam Ben Taleblu, who focuses on Iranian security issues for the Foundation of Defense of Democracies in Washington. Thank you so much for joining us on The Context. Let me ask you, first of all, should the US, do you think, step back from negotiations on the nuclear deal in light of what's happened here? OK, well, Behnam, thank you for that. Stay with us. I want to bring in the panel now. Amanda, specifically you, I want to ask you about, if potentially the US were to walk away from a nuclear negotiation, the nuclear deal negotiations, how would that impact on the US in terms of its image? Would the international community even side with Washington in that event? Behnam, it's good to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming onto The Context and giving us your point of view. Now, world leaders are meeting at the United Nations in New York today for what's being described as the final attempt to save the world's oceans. They're trying to agree on what a treaty that would protect large swathes of it from overfishing and other forms of exploitation. The UN High Seas Treaty has been through 10 years of negotiations, but has yet to be signed, and the deal is needed urgently. 2/3 of the planet's oceans are considered international waters, or high seas as they're also known, which means any country has the right to fish, sail or carry out research there. Well, only 1.2% of these high seas are protected. Under the treaty, 30% of all oceans would be turned into conservation areas by the year 2030. Well, let's talk to Liz Caron, a project director of the High Seas Conservation Programme at the Pew Charitable Trusts and an observer at the talks in New York. How have the talks been going? OK, Liz, thank you so much for explaining all that so clearly to us. Thank you, Liz Caron, once again.
Thank you very much.
Now, US law enforcement officials are on high alert this week. The FBI and Department of Homeland Security have warned of an increase in online threats following last week's search of Donald Trump's private residence in Florida. Mr. Trump and his allies claim the action was politically motivated, even though it was approved by a federal judge, and the White House has denied any involvement. Officials say there have been specific threats towards individuals and FBI facilities, as well as broader calls for civil war and armed rebellion. Will Summer is the politics reporter with the Daily Beast and the author of the upcoming book Trust and Plan, which is about the QAnon conspiracy theory. Let me ask you first of all, Will, and thank you very much for joining us on The Context. How real are these social media threats against the FBI? OK, Will Summer, it's good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us on The Context. Now, it's time for the panel. And this evening, we've asked our two guests, our two panellists, to give us an idea of what they'd like to talk to bring their ideas to the table. And Joe, let's go to you first of all. You want to talk about COVID and the impact that it's had on A-levels, and particularly results which are coming, I think, on the 18th of August in England, at least, England and Wales. What is the worry here in terms of the impact of COVID on the results for students this year?
Absolutely, but science fiction is full of examples of what happens when you send people to the Earth.
Bad things happen in the films.
Yeah, exactly. We'll have to see which one of them is right. I think Event Horizon.
Don't even go. That was the worst ending to a film. That was literally horrific. That was horrific. OK, I want a happy ending story like Apollo 13. That was a good film. Right, well, listen, Amanda Renterie and Joe Twyman, it's been so good to talk to you both. Thank you for being amazing panellists this evening, and thank you to our audience at home for watching. You have been watching The Context on BBC News. Stay with us. World News America is coming up in just a few minutes. Bye-bye from me, though.
Hello there. Another bout of hot summer weather building across the Pacific Northwest this week and into California.